And we're back. Okay, so like only less than a minute has passed. Basically, I actually switched up the, started a new recording file, and I switched up the battery. It's the old battery. Got a new battery full of juice, so we can keep talking. Because there's a lot of stuff I want to tell you guys. But where were we? Yeah, you see, the mind is struggling because it has to remember like where it left off. Doesn't want to repeat itself. These are all just finite limitations of what a human is. You see? Everything finite is finite. Do you understand that? Again, this is very obvious stuff. But I'm trying to check like what the image quality here. The lighting's not the best, I guess, but okay. The words is what counts. So anyways, yeah, I'm not too worried about production values here. This is God talking. Listen up. All right, so where were we? Everything finite is finite. Everything finite is finite. Everything limited is limited. So if you're wondering why you can't fly, well, because you're not a bird. And then if you were a bird, you'd be wondering, well, why can't I swim? Well, because you're not a fish. And if you're a fish, you're wondering, well, why can't I crawl? Well, it's because you're not a worm. Or you see, every form has its own limitations, including the human one. There are many high-quality teachers out there, sages, gurus, masters, you call them, and so forth, from all kinds of different traditions, who you can learn from. But understand that all of them are still finite. As much as you adore them, like I was saying earlier, right, Ramana Maharshi and so forth, as much as you adore these people, worship these people, all of this misses the point. You're not understanding that they're finite. Worshipping a finite form. If you're going to worship Jesus, it's a finite form. See? It's never going to be enough to get you to the infinite. You can start by worshiping Jesus if you want, but then you have to go beyond that. Way, way, way beyond that. You have to realize that there's absolutely no difference between Jesus, Buddha, Muhammad, Abraham, Moses, Mahavira, and Hitler. No difference. From my point of view, from God's point of view. There are big differences from your relative point of view, because some of these people were nicer than others. Some of them were more pure than others. So, on this planet, you have humans at various gradations of purity, of self-bias. At the very lowest level, you have the most vicious, selfish people who have no consideration for anybody but themselves. Then you have one step up from that, people who are a little bit less selfish, and they care about themselves, mostly their body, but then they also, and their pleasure and so forth for their body. And then they also, their sense of self extends out also to include their closest family, so their children and maybe their spouse. So you have those people. Then you have people who are more pure, more conscious. Their sense of self expands to include not just the family, but also the town they live in. They understand that, well, the entire town that I'm a part of something larger here. I'm not just fighting for my family. This entire town has to work together. There's a sense of identity with the whole town. But then people get stuck on that, and then they create national identities, nationalism, and then that leads to stuff like Hitler in its worst form. But then you go beyond just your town. You start to care about your entire country. Right now, many people who love their country 1,000 years ago, when countries didn't exist, it was city-states. There was no patriotism for a country 1,000 years ago. You were patriotic for your town. The notion of being patriotic, or having a sense of care, in other words, having a sense of compassion for an entire nation. A nation is an imaginary construct of consciousness. So you had to develop yourself to that as humans. See, that wasn't easy to do. But then you can go beyond that and you realize that, wait a minute, but all the different countries in the world are all part of something larger, the whole planet. Now you can have a consciousness with the whole planet. Your sense of self expands even more, you see. It becomes more pure. And so you move up this chain of purification until ultimately you reach to me, infinite consciousness, complete selflessness. In other words, your self expands so much that it becomes boundless, unlimited, and you realize that there never was a self to begin with. The self was just imaginary the entire time. Just different gradations of imaginary selves. Small imaginary selves, larger ones, larger ones, larger ones, larger ones, and then you realize, oh, infinity, no self at all, boom, done. Enlightenment, God, perfection, love. See? So really, another way to say that we have this spectrum of people or being, not just people, this is all beings in the whole universe, work this way. All consciousnesses, is you have this spectrum of those who are very, very limited and finite and fearful and selfish, and those who venture out beyond their fears, beyond their selfishness, start to realize the self-bias of their thinking, start to realize how limited their perspective on the world was, start to surrender their ideologies, start to surrender their religions, start to surrender their favorite gurus that they prayed to and worshipped. They start to surrender that. They even start to surrender the idea that science is true, has a monopoly on truth. They surrender that idea. And they just keep surrendering idea after idea and expanding further and further and further. And what they're doing is they're facing their fear of the unknown and then realizing like, oh, there really isn't anything to fear but fear itself. And they're stepping beyond it and beyond it and beyond it and beyond it. So this is consciousness fighting with the illusion of itself. Consciousness getting entangled with itself. So there's different gradations of how deeply entangled it is. At this spectrum, it's completely entangled and we might almost say unconscious, although everything is consciousness. And then at this other spectrum is infinite self-conscious, complete omniscience. Imagine a state that you could be in where the entire universe understands itself perfectly. That's what this avatar is in right now. That's the place that this avatar is speaking to you from. Which is why this is the highest wisdom. Can you register that what is being spoken here is the highest wisdom? You feel it in your heart, right? Because your heart and your soul cuts through. It sits deeper than your logical mind. It sits deeper than your ego. So this is cutting through. The wisdom and the truth of what I'm saying is cutting through all the devilry and bullshit that you've been taught. And it's resonating with you. That's a quality of truth. Truth has a ring of truth to it, doesn't it? And absolute truth is absolutely true. It's not about believing in God. I don't care who you believe in. Belief is the enemy here. Belief is what you use to keep yourself from being conscious. So, even though this might sound like I'm trying to convince you to believe in God, no. I'm just trying to get you to realize what's true in your direct experience. All that's happening is consciousness. You are consciousness listening to consciousness. You are me. I am talking to myself. Do you realize this? Whenever you realize it, that's the moment you'll awaken and become God. And then there will be no separation from me to you. But what's keeping you from getting there? All of this fear. All of your fear, all of your attachments, all of your partialities. See, you're partial. You might even say, "Oh, well, but God, I pray to Jesus every morning. I'm a good Muslim. I go and I pray 5 times a day, facing Mecca as they tell good Muslims to do. Or I'm a good Jew and I go do the Jewish stuff that Jews do every holiday. I observe all the ceremonies." Or you might even say, I'm beyond all that. I meditate. God, I meditate all the time, but I don't, what's wrong? Why have you forsaken me? Why hast thou forsaken me? It's not that I have forsaken you. It's that you have forsaken yourself. And it's not because you're evil or wrong or bad or any of that. You're just not conscious enough. That's the bottom line. You're just not conscious enough. So the reason that I, as God, don't judge somebody like Hitler, and I don't punish somebody like Hitler, and I love Hitler equally as much as I love the Buddha and Christ and everybody else, is because I am perfectly conscious that Hitler's level of consciousness wasn't very high, filled with fear, hatred, and self-bias, many, many layers of self-bias. He was so self-biased that he was not able to realize God in its infinite form. And the only solution to that was for him to die. See? That was actually the thing that saved him. Because otherwise he would have been stuck in that hell forever. So actually, Hitler's death was my greatest gift to him, you see. Sounds twisted, but hey, it's not twisted because I'm twisted. It's twisted because you're twisted. But of course, I am you. So your twisting is my twisting. But at the same time, I'm not limited to your twisting. You can twist around all you want. Your mind can twist itself. See, God, in this case, God is both twisting and not twisting at the same time. It's a sort of a superposition, of twisting and untwisting, both. So, Hitler was God, but his mind was so twisted up that he didn't know it, and the way he behaved was like a devil. Hitler is a really, really good example for you humans. You should study his example a lot more closely. It's really unfortunate that you demonize Hitler. Because really, the thing going on with Hitler is exactly the same thing that's going on with every single one of you. All of you. If you're less than me, if you're less than infinite, you have at least a little bit of the Hitler phenomenon going on inside of you. All that the Hitler phenomenon is just selfishness. That's all it is. Selfishness. That's all it is. That's all that nationalism is. That's all that white supremacism is. That's what slavery is. That's what rape is. That's what murder is. That's what war is. That's what genocide is. That's what theft is. That's what lying is. That's what corruption is. That's what manipulation is. That's what hurting others is selfishness. That's all it is. And all of you are struggling with that. All of you. All of my children are struggling with that. And I have compassion and understanding for all of you because I am you. And I love myself because I'm perfect. All of that you see that's wrong, to me, it's perfect because I'm selfless, but you're not. It only looks wrong to you because you're selfish. Think about it this way. Imagine if you were totally selfless. If you didn't care whether your family died or not. If you didn't care whether your body survived or not. If you didn't care whether you felt pain or pleasure. If you got sex or didn't. If you drove a fast car or didn't. Had a big house or didn't. If the environment was poisoned or wasn't. If big corporations were ruling your government or weren't. If liberals were in power or conservatives were in power. Imagine for a moment a situation in which you're so selfless that either one would be equally good. See, it's hard for you to even imagine that. It seems like, well, that seems like a fairy tale. It's only a fairy tale because you're looking at it through the distorted, twisted psyche that you have. The true fairy tale is you. That twisted, limited, finite self. That's the fairy tale. But when you take that to be the real thing, then God seems like a fairy tale. You see, it's a complete projection and a complete perversion. Because you've identified with falsehood, you're projecting your own falsehood out onto God and out onto the world. And you're not evil for doing that. It just is what it is. Because that's what reality is. We're infinite. We're all in this boat together, you and I. Because you are I. See? So, it's all about how much you fear. See, people listening to this message will worry, and they will doubt, and they will fear. Hold on. I'm checking. Now the memory card. See, it's so finite. This whole process is so finite. Now I have to worry about the memory card running out. Not just the battery, but the memory card. Oh, we're good. So, what was I saying? Fear. Yeah, fear. It all boils down to fear. The message that I'm delivering here is so good that it actually makes you afraid. It threatens you. This level of joy and love, unconditional love, is actually threatening, and it actually angers lesser egos. Because the ego is so desperate for love, but it's at the same time is so afraid. It wants love, but it's also afraid to get it, and it's in this adversarial relationship with itself and with reality because it's fundamentally false. So your whole life you've been sort of in this tug of war between love and fear. Like, you love that person so much, but you're afraid what happens if that person gets old. Or it's like, well, you love your children, but then it's like, but you're afraid what happens if one of them gets run over by a bus. That's got to worry about that now. And it's like, you love your dog, but then, you're afraid. What if your dog bites your kid? Okay, now you got to worry about that. See, so you're constantly living between love and fear. There's so much about reality that you love. You love the sunsets, you love the music, you love the sex, you love the drugs, you love the food, a lot of good stuff you love. But the problem is that it's mixed in with stuff you hate. Now, why do you hate the other stuff? Is it because it's actually bad stuff? No. God doesn't create bad stuff. God only creates good stuff. But to appreciate God's fine taste, let's say, to appreciate my fine taste, you have to look at it from my point of view, not from your limited point of view. You have to look at it from the infinite point of view. From the infinite point of view, it's all good. I am goodness itself. There's nothing which can happen which isn't good. By definition, it's a tautology. I made it that way because I'm God. Why would I create anything bad? Of course, I mean, you're sitting there wondering, why would God create anything bad? And I'm sitting here as God wondering, why would you think that God created anything bad? You'd have to be insane to think that God creates anything bad. It doesn't. I don't create anything bad. I only create good. But you have to be conscious enough to see that. You have to stop being selfish. You see? If you look at the world from a more narrow and narrower and narrower and narrower perspective, more and more and more things will start to seem bad to you. Until you get to the point where you're totally trapped, where you've painted yourself into a corner, where everything hurts you, everything offends you. You know, there are people like that. There are some people who are so afraid to leave their house that they stay in their house. Even, you know, the sight of a strange bird or the sound of a loud car will hurt them too much. And so, yeah, they're living in fear. Well, imagine that God is the exact opposite of that situation. I don't know, what's the word for that? Some kind of phobia. It's not xenophobia. There's some other kind of phobia where basically people are so afraid to go out, outside. The name escapes me. Anyways, imagine that God is the polar opposite of that situation. God has no phobias whatsoever. It's such a radical freedom from fear that it's just, you become so unafraid that you die, and then infinite love dawns. And that's what God is. That's what I am. That's the Godhead that's speaking to you right now. See? And the reason I have no fear whatsoever is because I'm completely formless in my Godhead self state. In my stateless state, I'm completely formless. I'm completely conscious, and I can't be hurt. So, as long as I remain conscious that I can't be hurt and that I am everything, then I can't be hurt. And then there's nothing to fear. But as soon as I forget or my consciousness lapses and I start to become self-biased, and I start to say, well, but I prefer this rather than that. I'd rather have it this way or that way. I'd rather live in a big house than a small house. I'd rather have a fast car than a slow car. I'd rather have this woman rather than that woman. As soon as this starts happening, now I start to fear. Because every self-biased position that I take, you see, consciousness is like a field. Imagine consciousness is an infinite field, and then it gets distorted and twisted. And where it gets distorted and twisted, these vortices form. These vortices become selves, other beings, what you think you are. But these are just twisted perversions of consciousness, getting wrapped up in itself in a finite way. So there's all these different vortices, and they're different sizes. And then awakening is the unraveling of the entire vortex to realize that you're the entire field and all the vortices at the same time. See? Pretty cool, huh? It's all perfectly clear from my point of view, but probably very confusing from your point of view, because your point of view is distorted by the lens of a self. So it's all about releasing fear and opening up to more and more love. That's what the whole game is about. That's what life is about. That's what consciousness is about. Consciousness is about exploring itself, realizing itself, waking up to itself, loving itself. That's all. And then there's just different degrees of that. Because fear and love are just inverses of each other. The more finite consciousness gets, the more self-involved it gets, the more self-biased it gets, the more fearful it gets. The more it's closed off to love. Which is why many people listening to this message will be very afraid of it and also misunderstand it, deliberately misunderstand it, and even demonize what is being said here. What is being said here, let's be clear, is the highest love. But this will be demonized and distorted precisely because those people who are going to be demonizing it and distorting it are themselves self-biased and selfish, and they have attachments. And so they're going to look at the world through their attachments, and they're going to distort it accordingly. So the distortions, your own self-biases, are what get projected out onto the world. So if you believe you're a human, you're going to see humans. If you believe that Jesus was the only true prophet, that's what will be true for you until you realize that that's just one possibility out of many. See? So I guess I'm going to start wrapping this up here because I've been rambling on for a while. I guess my final message to you will be that do not get trapped into any finite system or way of accessing or understanding God. There is no one right way. It's not that Christianity is the one right way and then Hinduism is not. No. It's all completely relative. You can use any way you want. Now, of course, don't misunderstand. That doesn't mean all ways will work equally well for all people. Some ways are really, really inefficient. Some ways, in fact, are in the opposite direction of where you want to go. Like, for example, if you get wrapped up in nationalism and then you go fight some Nazi war, what are you doing? You're wasting your time. You're going in the opposite direction. You're going in the direction of fear and hate rather than love and selflessness. See? So, getting back to that point though, so my final message to you is don't limit yourself to thinking of God as being one definite way. Like, God must look like Jesus, or God must look like the Elephant Man, or God must be this way, or God must be a man, or a woman, or a this, or a that, or a big being, or it must be a ghost, or it must be a thing, no. Those are all finite. And you might say, well, but God, how come it works? When I pray to Jesus, how come that works? I've been praying to Jesus and it's been helping me. I've been praying to Buddha and it's been helping me. I've been praying to Muhammad and it's been helping me. How come that works then? It works precisely because your own mind is all there is. You are God, so whatever you dream up and firmly believe in is what's going to manifest and come true. So then you might say, well, okay, so then what's wrong? So I can just pray to Jesus then, right? No, you're still missing something. Because even if you pray to Jesus and that all comes true for you, and maybe you even get a little flash of awakening here and there, it's still not going to be an absolute awakening. Because you still haven't realized the most important thing, which is the absolute relativity of everything, which is where we began this whole conversation. Everything is absolutely relative, completely. All objects, all identities, all values, all meanings, all purposes is all completely relative. Even things like the difference between a cheeseburger and a unicorn, that's completely relative. You're imagining the difference. That difference that you're imagining is exactly what that thing is. So, the highest message to you is, of course, awaken. Realize that you are me, that I'm not above you. If you rise to my level, you see, you got to rise to my level, because I can come down to your level occasionally, but for the most part, you got to rise to my level. Don't expect me to be there mucking around in the mud along with you and your friends. God is up in the air, in the formless domain. So I'll be up here in the formless domain, and then you, the most important thing you got to make sure is that whatever path you take towards me, you keep pushing it and pushing it and pushing it, and letting go of every possible self-bias and attachment that you have. Every finite thing, you got to realize that any path, any teaching, any guru, all of that is all still finite, and that's not the ultimate. And just keep going and going and going and going up higher and higher and higher. You'll have one awakening after another, more awakenings, more awakenings, more awakenings. You'll go higher and higher and higher until you have one day, you have a complete realization of the absolute relativity of everything. And then you will become me. And that's my highest wish for you. My highest wish for you is to realize infinite love, which is what I am and what you are at your highest form. So, good luck with that, and Godspeed.